dealing with the fiscal cliff issues, I suspect that today was a watershed moment in the negotiations. Senator Jim DeMint, one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate, who was very closely allied with the Tea Party, announced that he was resigning today and going to run the Heritage Foundation. So what it's come down to now, as Republicans are capitulating on these negotiations, is that we're going to get a deal. And they're saying it publicly now. 40 Republicans in Congress have sent a letter along with some Democratic counterparts to the president offering to reach a bipartisan solution to the fiscal cliff, which would include, listen, unfortunately for many people in the room, higher tax rates. But we don't know if they're going to be 39.6% as they were under Clinton, or if they're going to find a compromise at 37%, close off some loopholes. Some deal will be struck. We're not going over the cliff, is my bet. And if you look at the behavior of the stock market, it's clearly not as worried as it was on November 7th. In the week after President Obama was reelected, market went down 5%. We've regained about 4.5% of that decline. So clearly something's changed with market psychology relative to what it was thinking on November 7th, that there was no deal possible. The president, for better or worse, has more leverage than many of the Republicans thought, and this deal will get done. Not entirely on his terms. He will give somewhat, but we're not going over the cliff. I know that a whole host of individuals have written that we're going over the cliff. Grover Norquist wrote that we're going over the cliff. Karl Rove wrote that we're going over the cliff. There are some Democrats who want us to go over the cliff in order to strengthen assuming that that strengthens the president's hand. I don't think it does. So the market now is beginning to discount a positive resolution to that problem. And as Ben Bernanke had suggested at the New York Economics Club 2 weeks ago, if we do not go over the cliff, 2013, in his words, could be a very good year. That is something wildly uncharacteristic for him to have said, because mostly over the last many months, he has been talking about still the subpar performance of the economy, the low rates of, the high rates of unemployment, and how the Fed is going to keep interest rates down until they are absolutely certain that this economy will continue to grow at a self-sustaining rate and that unemployment comes down below, let's say, roughly 7%, maybe even lower than that. So this was an uncharacteristic, upbeat comment from the Fed chief, and that went unreported to a certain extent. Most everybody focused on the other thing that he said, which was if we go over the fiscal cliff, the Fed doesn't have the tools to offset the fiscal drag we'd experience from $600 billion in tax hikes and spending cuts that would take place on January 1st. That was the headline that everybody walked away with, because he was very explicit about the Fed's inability to offset that problem. But he also said if we didn't have it, we would have a very good 2013. And so when you take all this together, at least from my perspective, again, I'm repeating myself, but I think we're in considerably better shape. There are a lot of people who have a vested interest in selling books, in getting notoriety by continuing to preach gloom and doom. And there's one thing about the end of the world trade that I've learned over time. I was on the air today, in fact, with Art Cashin, who I've known for close to 28 years. He's on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. For those of you who watch CNBC, Art's somebody who is a rather unique character on the floor. He's been a trader since 1962. He trained, in fact, during the Cuban Missile Crisis as a broker in 1962. And one of the most instructive experiences he had was during his training in that period. The instructor was asking the individuals in the class what they would do if we had a nuclear altercation with Russia via Cuba. And the missiles were expected to fly. And every individual in the room, to a man, raised his hands and said they would sell stock. And the instructor said no, because if we're having a nuclear war with Russia, you buy stocks. Because if the missiles fly, they're never going to fill your order. And if they don't, it's a buying opportunity of a lifetime. And so when you hear this end of the world stuff, and we were far closer in the winter of 2008 and the spring of 2009 than we are today, you have to remember the math of the end of the world bet. To put it a different way, if you bet on the end of the world and you're right, you won't get paid. And you also have to be right on timing, because it only happens once. And so this is really a fool's errand. And so March of 2009, when the Fed was all in, and this was something I talked about on CNBC at the time, wrote a book about as well, I was advocating that people buy stocks in 2009 and buy real estate, because these were generational opportunities. Stock market's gone up 110% in 3 years. Residential real estate, if you bought it at the low, has already begun to appreciate and will continue to do so for the next 5, 10 years. We've gone through a full bear market in real estate, typically is 5 years long. Now this was deeper than most, but peak to trough, it's typically a 5-year period, and we've passed that threshold. And the behavior of markets this time thanks to Ben Bernanke again, relative to the U.S. in let's say from 1929 to 1932, radically different as well. We had a 50% decline in stock prices here in the U.S. during the crisis. If you go back to the crash in 29, the Dow peaked in September of 1929 at 381. In July of 1932, it was at 41. It was down 90%. 41 was the price at which the Dow first opened in 1896. You were able to buy the Dow in 1932 at 1896 prices. And we subsequently had, an extremely long depression. It took 25 years for the Dow to get back to its 1929 high. Now, compare and contrast that to today. We went down 50% and subsequently went up 110%. We're within 1,000 points of an all-time high on the Dow and relatively close on the S&P. NASDAQ's a separate story because of where it was during the internet bubble. But stocks have recovered a great deal of ground, and so has the economy. So people keep making this bet that the game is over. The game's just starting. And I would say relative to the rest of the world, the U.S. is going to outperform, I think, and shock a lot of people over the course of the next several years. And that's relative to China, that's relative to Europe, it's relative to India, and relative to Brazil. And I think that will be the surprise story of the next several years, that the U.S. is going to look much more like the economy of the 1950s and 60s than any other period we've seen in our lifetime. And I would take some heart to that. Now, granted, there are a variety of things that can make this forecast wrong. We could have a massive war in the Middle East over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Something could go wrong with North Korea. Europe could collapse under its own weight and touch off another banking crisis. China could ultimately fall considerably farther in economic terms than people anticipate today. But those, again, are possibilities. They're not probabilities. Seems like we've crossed the threshold in Europe. Seems like we're crossing the threshold with the fiscal cliff. And so I do think that, I would, if I were you, ignore a lot of the gloom and doom talk. You have an experience right here with CNB, which you've just added a C to it. You'd have a very fine company, I might add. But here at CNB, you've managed to grow through a recession, as Stu said, and a crisis. And I know some others who have been able to do that as well. And it is shocking that that happens, and that a financial institution has been able to grow.
It's good management.
It's great management. It's fabulous management. It's unique management that gets you there. And it is also you, the client, by the way, I might add. I'm just making sure I'm going to get paid tonight. But with that as backdrop, I'd like to make this a little more interactive. I don't want to talk for an hour and take some questions. I will go so far as to answer queries about the disastrous 3-year period in which CNBC forced me to wear a hairpiece. I talk about that. It's a true story. I talk about it publicly from time to time. It's good therapy for me. And as I look around the room, some of you may benefit from that experience as well. So feel free to fire away at will. Very happy to answer any questions. Don't be shy. I know you want to get dessert and more drinks. Can I say that with the camera on? Yeah. Go ahead, sir, please.
What would you say to people who say, if we're going to have 3 and 4% growth, we should go over the fiscal cliff. It'll knock 1.5 points off of growth, and we'll get some discipline in our spending and increase our tax revenues and balance out for the future?
That's a risky proposition, because 3 to 4% growth assumes we don't go over the cliff.
You just said?
No, I said I'm assuming we're not going over the cliff. Okay, so I would say 3% to 4% if we don't go over. The problem is the shock to the system, particularly for middle class and lower income individuals, will be relatively steep. Remember that the payroll tax holiday expires. That's $2,000 a year. If rates go up for middle class individuals, that could sap their spending capability. Look, I mean, for people at the top 2%, it only really matters at the margin. It's not going to affect the spending of very wealthy people, whether they're paying, and I'm not an advocate of higher taxes by any stretch of the imagination. I'd much prefer we do Simpson Bowles. And I wish they would have done it 2 years ago. The president threw those guys under the bus. They're fabulous men. They've done a great plan. It's the plan that should be adopted. It may not be the plan we have. But going over the cliff is a risky proposition, because fiscal drag can be a very, very big deterrent to growth. And it also engenders considerable uncertainty that would then take even longer to be resolved than we're experiencing right now. We're going through some pain of uncertainty here as we move toward the end of the year, which is restraining some forms of corporate spending and hiring and things like that. They have to clear this problem, and they also have to point out that we are not Europe, that we are capable of addressing an issue where we sit now on the cusp of a crisis. And so I think the calculus there I understand the desire for fiscal discipline, but austerity does not get you growth. And Europe is finding that out in spades. I mean, there are riots in Greece that are taking place again because the economy there is in depression. Now, there are people who compare us to Greece on a regular basis. We are not Greece. Let me be clear. They are a $308 billion economy. It's a tourist destination with a government, right? With all due respect to any Greeks in the room. When you think about what's going on in Greece, over 50% of the population works for the government. Okay? They get paid for 14 months of work. They work for 10, and they don't pay taxes. That is not the model that we have here. You know, we should all be so lucky as to get 14 months of pay, 10 months of work, and you know, really not and avoid taxes assiduously. I had friends who just returned from Greece this summer. Two women that I know live our town. They and their husbands the girl's father went to Greece. They were at a restaurant. I believe it was 9 or 10 people. The bill was about $1,000. Waiter came out with the bill. Father handed the card to pay for the bill, and he said, "Would you mind paying in cash?" Father said, "No, take the card." He said, "Excuse me, I have to go talk to the proprietor." Came out, asked him to go to an ATM and get cash. He said, "Absolutely not. Take my credit card." The guy didn't want to pay taxes on the bill. This is a different deal. You can't do that in the U.S. You could try. You know, and back, you know, in my neighborhood in Little Italy, there used to be all cash restaurants for a variety of reasons. But, you know, we don't do that here. We have a tax collection system, and we're far more efficient in that regard than other countries, particularly Europe. I mean, there's tax avoidance in Italy and Spain that is just rampant. We could take that chance, but you are risking another recession, which is the reason I would avoid that entirely. It's not, I don't think it's worth it. I mean, someday we will get some adults in Washington who deal with this problem a little bit more forthrightly. We do have to get over the cliff, though, to be in a position to handle it in a more mature way. And that may happen. I think that look, I mean, if you look at the way the chips are falling, there's going to be some cutback in entitlement programs. There's going to be tax reform next year as an adjunct to what's being negotiated right now. So I'm actually reasonably optimistic that they're going to do some semblance of the right thing. It won't be the $4 trillion grand bargain that we could have had last year, or what I think is a very wise plan in terms of Simpson-Bowles. That may not get enacted as one would have hoped. But going over the cliff is risky business.